Good evening from wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the BSHS Digital Festival. This session is Digital Intersections Around the Scientific Collections. I'll hand things over to Becky to get going.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everyone. So there are several ways of watching this session. We have a Zoom meeting, there is the lobby, and there is also YouTube. Those of you who are in the meeting, hopefully will have an opportunity to have proper discussion at the end of the session. So anyone who is watching on other streams may want to come in to get in to be part of the action. At that point, we'll stop streaming it out to YouTube because we'll be on chat and we'll have our cameras on and that sort of thing. But just so you know the structure, it's a session of two parts, looking at two different projects. One, Tools of Knowledge, which I and Sarah, who I'll get to introduce herself in a minute, will be talking about. And we'll talk for something like 40 minutes, or we'll have around 40 minutes for talking and some traditional Q&A using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen initially. Then we're going to take a break because we think screen breaks are a great idea. So there'll be 5 or 10 minutes where you can get up. We'll just have a holding slide, all our cameras will go off. Then we'll move to the second part with Geoff and Alex, who will be talking about Communities and Crowds project. And then we'll transition into 15 or 20 minutes of hopefully proper and good discussion at the end there. Just to introduce myself more properly, I'm Rebekah Higgitt. I'm Principal Curator of Science at National Museums Scotland, and I'm just taken over this month as Principal Investigator on the Tools of Knowledge project. If I could ask Sarah to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Sarah Middle. I'm postdoctoral researcher on the Tools of Knowledge project. And I'm also a postdoctoral researcher on the Congruence Engine project at the Science Museum.
Geoff.
Hi everyone, I am Geoff Belknap. I am keeper at National Museums Scotland and principal investigator for the Communities and Crowds project.
And Alex.
Hi, I'm Alex Fitzpatrick. I'm the research associate on the Communities and Crowds project here at the National Science and Media Museum. It's a bit of a mouthful.
That's why I asked you to introduce yourself. I didn't have to remember that one. Thanks very much. You'll see Geoff and Alex after the break. And if I could ask Sarah to start the PowerPoint slides for our initial talk. Great, hopefully people can see that. I'm going to introduce the Tools of Knowledge project initially. If we can go to the next slide. And what we're going to talk about. So there's the full title of our project, HRC funded, running now till the end of this year. It's a project initially led at HBS in Cambridge with Eva Taub and Boris Jardine and Josh Null. University of Sussex with Alex Butterworth as the co-I there, National Museums of Scotland. We've had Sarah working with us and Duncan Hay, whose name will come up, working at Sussex. And we also have two project partners, Science Museum and Royal Museums Greenwich. And we'll hear a little bit more about some of the work that we've been doing with their collections, certainly Greenwich, as we go along. So one of the themes that we might come back to, I think, in our Q&A and after you've heard both presentations is about the nature of these kinds of collaborative projects and the different kinds of skills and people that need to be part of them. The requirement that there is for mutual learning between historians, curators, different kinds of digital expertise. Digital people are not all the same. Historians may not realise that, but that is part of the learning. I think also just generally the awareness of the different sort of kinds of labour and contributions that are involved. And that's something that different experience in the room might allow us to have a good discussion about later. The focus of the talk that we are giving first is I'm going to introduce the project, but also some of the platforms and programmes that we've been using, some of which require very specialist skill, well beyond my skill set, and others that have a lower bar in terms of use and access to them. So the core of our project, just so you know, is about scientific instrument makers rather than instruments, although one of the things we're trying to do is to link the makers with records of instruments as well. This is a project that was called Simon. You can see what that stands for on the left-hand side. That exists at the moment, well, in several formats, but the sort of the core one is an access database that is only accessible through actually visiting Royal Museums Greenwich. So one of our jobs is to make this database, which was developed by Gloria Clifton in particular at Greenwich, into something that is widely available, but also remodeled semantically in a way that really brings to life the data and the connections that are within that data set. The Access database did produce the Directory of British Scientific Instrument Makers by Gloria, which is an essential resource for anyone who works with instrument collections and allied work, but the Access database and the project database, when it's available, have much more in there. There's something like 11,000 records and just many more connections and relationships and data points beyond that. So the core of the data is about makers and businesses, about relationships to apprentices or family or business connections. There's information about the instruments that exist or were advertised by these people, guilds that they may have been part of, the dates that they worked or are alive, information about sources and addresses. So it's not a museum catalogue kind of data, although we are thinking about that kind of information as well, but it is certainly a database that was largely produced by a curator, and other curators have fed into it. It draws very much on museum collections and provides the kind of information that curators need, but also hopefully through the work we're doing, making it of use and interest to other people as well. So the process of turning the Access database into our semantically modelled one is tricky and complicated, it turns out. Interim work led by Duncan Hay at Sussex used the Django framework to begin to explore, split out and link the data in different ways, identifying different kinds of relationship, geographical locations, making top-level links to information in collections, records from museums, and making it ready for ingestion in a new platform, which you'll hear about in a moment from Sarah. This work has allowed us to do various things already, some spatial analysis of various sorts. This slide here just gives you a very broad sense of looking at all the data in the database over a sequence of time, if you're looking clockwise from there. So you can see immediately the huge dominance of London in the story, but also, you know, a changing sort of provincialisation of the trade, and perhaps particularly the dominance of places, port cities like Liverpool and Glasgow. We've also done much more detailed, Duncan especially, work on geocoding, something like 20,000 addresses to city, town, village, and in some cases, some cities to street level as well. And I'll come back later in the presentation to some of the possibilities for visualising that and some of the other data in the database. Just to add before I pass on to Sarah about this miscellaneous field that exists in the original Simon database, which is a really rich source, but very unstructured. So that is something that is full of fantastic information about the people and the businesses, but hard for a machine to read and understand it. So I'm going to pass over to Sarah to talk about how we begin to deal with this kind of thing.
Okay, so this is an example to show our event-based data model. So that means that the event is at the heart of the data model rather than, say, a particular person, for example. So on this slide, we've got the apprenticeship events at the centre, and that has clearly defined relationships to the people and organisations involved in each apprenticeship, including the roles that they played. And it also includes its own sub-events of bound and freed from bounds, which then have dates that designate when an apprenticeship would have started and ended. So from visualising this kind of simplified version of an event as a network, we can imagine how this mini network could then build outwards to link to other pieces of information and related events that are connected to, say, the people and the organisations involved. So using this approach to data modelling therefore allows rich interlinking between the different components that were held in the original database. To manage and publish our data, we are using a platform called Arches. So this platform was originally developed for cultural heritage and archaeology, but it's since been used more broadly for humanities research. It's open source, and this means that the source code is freely available for people to use and customize. So we didn't have to pay for it, which is great, but obviously there are other costs to that as well that I'll come on to. It was created for the Getty Conservation Institute and the World Monuments Fund by Farallon Geographics, who are continuing to support it. So it's continually being developed and improved. And it's got wide institutional support. Historic England are a major user of Arches, as well as many local authorities in the UK, universities and national governments. There are various features of Arches that act as good selling points for it and that attracted us to it for this project. So it's possible to extend and customize, although some technical knowledge for that is required, some kind of coding and programming knowledge. So it's been invaluable having Duncan on our team to be able to do that. As I mentioned before, development of Arches is ongoing. It's continually being improved by its developers at Farallon. So there are always new features being added to it, and it's being maintained so we know it's up to date, sort of security-wise, for example. There's a lot of community support from other Arches users. So this is often the case for open source software. You'll often have a sort of community that builds up around support forums, offering advice and support for other users. In terms of the functionality of Arches itself, it has good integration with GIS, that's Geographic Information Systems data. So this means that it's really easy to produce geographic visualizations if you've got appropriately geocoded data in your database. It also has a search and browse functionality so that you're able to explore the data easily. And you can have different user roles and you're able to manage the permissions for those. So you can have people who are sort of basic users who can search or browse the data. You can have, say, editors that are able to add or edit data, and then administrators who are able to manage the whole thing. And crucially for us at Tools of Knowledge, it allows you to create data models without coding. So I showed our apprenticeship model as an example previously, so how we'd sort of visualised how all of the different components of an apprenticeship would fit together. And this is how it appears in Arches. So for each node in the network, we fill out a simple form. So we give it a name. So in this case, we're looking at the apprenticeship model. We've got a node that is called apprentice. We have its relationship to the concept we're modelling. So where it says relation to apprenticeship, that's had apprentice. So apprenticeship had apprentice. And then it has the type of entity that it should point to. So we say that an apprentice is a type of person. As I mentioned in the last slide, a major selling point of Arches is that it's possible to specify these nodes and relationships using a simple web form rather than having to code. So that's really helpful to me as a metadata specialist who doesn't have a huge amount of coding experience, that I'm able to do that. And that's going back to what Becky was saying about digital skills are not one and the same. Different people on the project have added different skills and knowledge to different parts of the process. There are, however, some issues with Arches. So the initial setup and also data import are quite complex and time consuming. And for that, it's been really important to have somebody with those relevant skills on the project team. So to set up Arches in the first instance, but also each time we want to add data into it. And when you're in the process of building a database, it isn't just one simple data import and you're done. You often have to go back and do things again and redo it. So it's been really helpful to have Duncan who's been able to help us with that. Some of the documentation is poor. This means it can be difficult to solve any issues that come up that are sort of system specific. Even if you do have the requisite technical skills, though, you should be able to solve them. Also, from a user perspective, search is currently limited to one entity type at a time. So even though our data is structured with all these rich connections between entities of different types, Arches doesn't currently let you take full advantage of this, although we are assured this feature is coming this year. So fingers crossed for that. I mentioned before about Arches being really good for geographic data, although that has possibly come at the expense of other types of data visualizations. So there's limited scope, for example, to create networks or timelines from data in Arches, which might be more appropriate depending on what your database is trying to do. And finally, we had to design a bespoke ontology for structuring our data. So what that means is that we had to spend considerable time defining a vocabulary of terms that represent all the entities and events in our data, as well as the relationships between them. There are existing vocabularies that we could have used for this purpose, but there is no one vocabulary that does exactly what we need, and Arches doesn't let you mix and match different vocabularies, so you have to pick one and stick to it. But despite these issues, it is still the best and crucially most affordable option for our purposes. I'm going to hand back to Becky now.
Thank you. Affordable and available is certainly important, because one of the things we're doing with this version of the database is handing it back to Royal Museums Greenwich, who will be hosting it, we hope, sort of long term and accessibly. So we have to be able to give them something that we can hand on. We are thinking about different ways of visualizing our data, but there is very much a live question. It's very much work in progress, and a live question as to how much that will be integrated or feeding off the data that's in the Arches version of the database. It may be that it feeds off a second stack, so we're also building the database in Neo4j, I think, if I've got that right, and that will be more of a sort of researcher's tool, essentially, and sort of much more thick data in there for us to work with. But we've already been able to carry out some probes into social and spatial analysis of various sorts, again, relying very much on Duncan to help us produce some of these. So I've listed some of the programs there that are, well beyond my capability to tell you anything about. But as I say, Duncan has been able to help us, but it's allowed us to map makers generally. So on the bottom left is a map of Edinburgh, and I think sort of all the makers that we have in those particular locations have been pinpointed onto streets there. It can also, this kind of what you can combine different kinds of queries about, say, some of the miscellaneous data on institutional connections and social connections. So the map at the top on the left-hand side is of London, and it shows makers who were connected into observatory networks, so who provided instruments for observatories, and then also on top of that, some of their immediate social or family or business connections as well. The data visualizations on the other side are from Geoff, showing networks, social networks or business network relationships. And again, this is a subset of our data from individuals connected to observatories and their circles around there as well. Something we might talk about at the end is what this kind of visualization tells us, how it relates to our historical data, how historians can make use of it, or whether it tells us things that we thought we already knew, or if it is a new way of providing new insights. So it would be good to discuss that more. Another area we've been trying to visualize our data is through alluvial flows, which can be very pretty and I think informative as well. This first one is quite simple. Again, this is my set of observatory connected makers and their wider social networks beyond that. And this flow shows them as two different groups, and it shows the different guild connections that they had, which I think tells us something about this group compared to some other groups. So again, being able to make comparisons of different sets of makers over time will be really useful. And alluvial flows can also look rather more complicated, like this next slide, which you may not be able to see fully on your screens, I'm afraid, but this is created by Andrew Richardson at the University of Northumbria, who's been working with our data, and looks fantastic. I'm very excited to get to play with it, which again, it's not quite live yet, so we can't share it, but soon, hopefully we'll be able to do that. But you can set up different columns here with information on locations, instruments that were advertised, instruments that are known to exist by particular makers, and guilds, for example. So here, they've been set up this way, so you can turn these columns on and off or reorder them in different ways, and then you can pick out the different lines to get information. So here we've got the set of makers who are in London, who there are known instruments of chronometers, who also advertised chronometers and were members of the Clockmakers Guild. And that brings out a subset there of others. But if you reordered this, you might get something different, or you can pick out any one of those flow lines and get a different set of makers. And you can also change that according to date as well, and also draw out from those makers to make the kind of network, social network type of graphs we were looking at before. So I think this will be really exciting once we can all get our hands on it. Back to you, Sarah.
So as well as the data that's already in Simon, we're also hoping to integrate data from our partner institutions, and largely this consists of collections data. So for example, at National Museums Scotland. So linking in this object data potentially adds a lot more information. So we can add more on makers, users, uses, places, and materials. And another thing that we've been doing with this object data in relation to our database is to construct object itineraries. So in the earlier slides, I talked about life events for people. So for example, in the apprenticeship example that I gave, object itineraries represent a sequence of life events for objects as they travel through space and time. These events might include their creation, use, alteration, movement, and acquisition, and ultimately their decay or destruction. A similar term used to describe these sequences is object biographies, but we prefer object itineraries because it implies more continuity rather than an object existing between fixed events of birth and death. So in an itinerary, we might look back to the formation of the materials from which the object was constructed, or we might look forward to future receptions or remediations. So in the following examples, Becky and I will demonstrate how gathering, analysing and structuring data about an object or group of objects can help us to reconstruct its itinerary. Our first example relates to an assemblage of navigational and surveying instruments that NMS received from the Admiralty in 1911, and some of these are shown on this slide. So to identify some of the key entities and relationships in the metadata about the Admiralty acquisition, we used a tool called Rebekah. Rebekah is a free online platform. It was developed as part of the Pelagios network. It enables named entity recognition and annotation of both text and images, although obviously this example shows text. So in the example on the slide, we've applied named entity recognition to the text. So it's automatically identified places, which are in green, people and organisations, which are in blue, and events or dates, which are in purple. Once this automated process is complete, you can then go back through the data manually to approve or reject Rebekah's suggestions and to add any that have been missed. You can also manually annotate any other types of entity that aren't automatically picked up by the system and apply your own set of tags. So these are shown in yellow in the example here. And we've used this feature particularly for things like objects, where we've tagged them with the relevant scientific apparatus type from a vocabulary that we're currently developing. And then finally, you can add and define relationships between different entities in the document. And these are shown as dotted arrows with labels on them. Annotation like this can be a really useful exercise in itself to give you an idea of what's in your data, where the connections are. But the annotations are themselves stored as data, which means that you can then use them in other ways to gain more insights about your material. Place is particularly well integrated within Rebekah. So when you annotate a place, it will automatically try and match it up to a gazetteer or an authority file for a place that has the same name. Obviously, this requires a bit of manual checking and correction because sometimes multiple places can have the same name. But once you're happy that your places are linked up correctly, Rebekah can provide a geographic visualization to show them on a map. So here you can see all the places that were mentioned in the data about the Admiralty 1911 instruments, and which were possible to link to gazetteers in Rebekah. While most of the places are included, there were some that were not possible to match up to the places in gazetteers held by Rebekah. This is often the case when working with historical place data, as place names and boundaries change over time, and additional specialist gazetteers are often required to fully represent the level of nuance that you need. I should say that Pelagios, which is the initiative that developed Rebekah, started life as an ancient world project. So coverage in this domain is much better than it is for more recent history, although it's being continually developed and improved over time. You can also export your annotation data from Rebekah in various formats to use in other software. So here we've exported the data and opened it in Excel, where we could create a bar chart to show the frequencies of the people and organisations that are mentioned in the text. As you can see, a bit more work on this data is required. So we might want to think about whether we want to combine instances where the same person or organisation is referred to in slightly different ways, or we might want to separate the people and organisations that had a direct relationship to the instruments at the time from the people who've conducted research about them more recently. But hopefully these slides have given an idea of the kind of work that can be done using software like Rebekah and how this might help to bring us closer to constructing itineraries for this set of objects. I'm going to pass back to Becky for our next example.
So yeah, the time it takes to assemble, clean and analyse data is always large and always larger than you think it's going to be, and it can be a limiting factor on projects like this. And it's one good reason to turn to other labour by crowdsourcing, which is something that we have done with this project, Voyages in Time, on Zooniverse. And Sarah will talk about how we set that up in a moment. The following session we'll be talking about another Zooniverse project and volunteers and giving them more say in the kind of work that they're doing. So come back to that, but just to introduce what we're working on. For Voyages in Time, we're using data that's held at Greenwich, the Admiralty chronometer ledgers that were used at the observatory to track the chronometers that came in and out of the observatory and went out to naval dockyards, on ships, and so on. So it details their movements in and out. Those documents have happily already been scanned and basic details recorded in a database. So we're using that to then build on in this Zooniverse project called Voyages in Time. I'm just going to post the link for that as well. We hope that we'll be able to get the data from this when it's transcribed to get more itinerary data that we can structure and model as object itineraries. So we can, through these data, track patterns of use, of testing and of repair of these objects. We can get information about the ships they went on, and we could, in some cases, very easily cross-reference the voyages that they then took, because chronometers went on well-known things like the Chanticleer and Beagle voyages, but other ones perhaps less well-known, but we can, very often still track those and point out where the people and the ships and the instruments on them went, and map their travels around the world. And their journeys and returns back to makers or to the observatory. So understanding these in tools and use, often over decades or more than a century.
So this is what our project looks like from the user perspective. So in our project, there are 3 workflows. The first is chronometer information. So that's very basic information about the chronometer itself, such as its maker and its number, any other additional information that users think might be interesting. And then we have transfers to, so that's when a chronometer goes out to, say, a ship or a captain or back to its maker. And then transfers from is when it comes back from them, back to the Admiralty. Each workflow has a separate form that the user can fill out with information from the documents. And users are guided through the process by tutorials. We've also got a detailed field guide and FAQ to help support our users. We're currently in the process of applying for official Zooniverse approval, but the project is live now. If anyone fancies having a go, there will be an opportunity after this talk. And then this is what Voyages in Time looks like behind the scenes. So Zooniverse provides a project builder, and this is where you can input details about the project, upload images, and specify what you want users to do. This particular screenshot shows the project details section, which is used to populate the landing page that Becky showed on the earlier slide. The project builder also provides you with space in the About and Collaborators sections, where you can add further details about your project. Then in the field guide and the tutorials, you can include instructions with images for how to complete the project tasks or workflows. And then under workflows, you can configure the workflows themselves by specifying the tasks that you would like users to perform. So in our case, selecting text using a rectangular box and then transcribing that text into an input form. And then in subject sets, you can upload the images that you would like users to transcribe. So in Zooniverse jargon, each image is a subject and each collection of images is a subject set. And getting used to this kind of jargon is something that goes hand in hand with using different types of digital software on a digital project. And As ever, there are some issues with the software. So with Zooniverse, it's not always clear how to make it do what you want it to, or indeed whether this is permitted. The documentation can be quite variable in quality, and having to search for answers to questions using the Zooniverse forums can be a bit frustrating and time-consuming. Also, the Zooniverse developers have focused heavily on mobile-first design. So this is with the aim of making it easier to contribute to projects while using a mobile device. But this has had the trade-off of occasionally compromising user experience for users with larger screens. So, for example, in our project, the default size for displaying a page image was too small to navigate and select the text easily, but we weren't able to adjust this ourselves. We weren't able to adjust this ourselves, and instead we had to then ask the Zooniverse team to fix it for us, which is a bit of an inefficient process. Data can easily be exported as a CSV, so a comma-separated values file, so basically like a text version of a spreadsheet. But actually getting to the user transcriptions from within those CSVs is quite difficult, as they're mixed up with metadata, such as the coordinates of the rectangle drawn to select the area on the page. So you need to download a bespoke piece of software that puts the data into a sensible format, and that requires some use of the command line. And then the data still needs a bit of tidying up afterwards, for which we use a program called OpenRefine. So again, requiring more technical skills and knowledge than perhaps it would first appear. Although ultimately, Zooniverse is a handy tool that allows you to do quite a lot of clever stuff without coding. Again, our experience with this tool highlights the need for collaborative teams with complementary skill sets.
So lots of conclusions and lessons learned potentially, but just some things that we wanted to highlight. As we said more than once, digital projects involve a whole range of things and people and skills and tools. And of course, digital projects can be on different scales, and there are different levels of expectations. Some of these tools I think individuals might want to use, and it could give them useful insights into what they're working on. I think familiarization with the range out there is generally probably useful. I think digital projects in terms of what's being funded are not going away anytime soon. They may well be the opportunities that are available to postdocs as they complete their PhDs. So being sort of ready to have the conversations, if nothing else, I think is really important. It's a part of the learning curve to just realize that the time taken for data preparation is going to be a huge amount of your project, and every time I hear that this always ends up taking more time at the beginning of the project than expected. Essentially, everyone on a project like this needs to be involved. It's not something that defaults to certain people. It's something that helps your thinking as a historian dealing with the data, and it's important, but it does take time, as does bespoke modelling that Sarah was talking about as well. So communication, managing of expectations within the project team, between historians and curators who aren't necessarily coming from the same place as historians, and technical specialists, is something that is always going to be really important. Sarah.
Similarly, managing expectations of using software to assist with processes. There is no piece of software that will do everything for you. You will probably reach a point where there's something that you'll need to do manually, and a lot of the time, as Becky was saying, preparation is needed. Visualizations don't come out of nowhere. There's often a lot of work that goes on in the background and outside of the software that you're wanting to use for it. In terms of the data modelling, that's something that's been a bit of a difficulty with this project, because we had very grand ideas of making a perfect, extremely nuanced, very rich data model. And I think in many ways that's what we have achieved. But ultimately, we had to settle for finished. And that's something that's a compromise that needs to be reached at some point in the project, so that you have the data in a state that you're able to actually work with it in the way that you want to and fulfill your research goals that you set out at the start of the project. And then finally, we've mentioned issues of sustainability and cost a few times. but funding models aren't really set up adequately for this kind of digital project. So humanities funding is often geared towards a project with a fixed end date that then has traditional publications as outputs from that project. But with a digital project, the aim is always to produce something that is a lot more ongoing, that people can then use as a research tool kind of going forward. And needing to plan for the sustainability of that tool can be quite tricky when you've got this fixed term funding and fixed term people that come along with the fixed term funding. I don't know if Becky has anything more to add to that.
No, I think that's essentially it from us. We've got a few minutes if there are any particular questions. I also might invite Geoff and Alex back into the visible room if they've got any comments on this. We will have chance at the end of the session to talk about this as well as the part 2 that we'll be coming to. So feel free to bring that, come back to that once we open up into a discursive room. But at the moment, if you've got any comments or questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and we will answer those. Otherwise, please do click on the links. The Recogito page is very nice. It's got some tutorials. I think it's quite friendly for users who want to sort of have a go playing with that. And please do also have a go with our Zooniverse project. We are very keen to have volunteers and also keen to get your feedback. So right now and then in the break that we've got before the second part of this session, if you can have a go with it and let us know, how intuitive it feels or any other comments, would be very pleased to know about that. So yeah, I think please do use the Q&A button. You're the refrain that we get often during this conference. Otherwise, Geoff, you've brought yourself back onto camera. Do you have any questions or comments?
No, I think it is. It's a really interesting set of data models that you guys have created for tools of knowledge, and I think we'll have a chance to chat more at the end of the session. But I think it's some of the points you've made about building is the barriers to building a Zooniverse project and the construction of what a team should look like when you're trying to do interdisciplinary citizen science work, I think is really interesting because it speaks to what we'll talk to in a minute, which is about kind of more volunteer-led or public-led research models. I don't have answers for that, but I think it's an interesting model that you guys have proposed.
Right. So there's a question from Alexander has come up on the chat. What programming languages are the tools of knowledge, I presume, based on, or the various different tools we're using? I know Python keeps coming up. So what else?
I'm not sure really. Our data model kind of at the core is in RDF. So resource description framework, so we can serialize that in various different formats. I know that the interim database that Becky spoke about at the beginning, that was built in Django. I'm not sure exactly what Arches is built in. I know it uses Elasticsearch as its front end. I think it might actually be a MySQL database that is running the whole thing. But that's not really my kind of specialism, so it's a bit of a mix.
Yeah. And Django uses Python, I think, doesn't it? Which is Duncan's sort of speciality.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think that's right.
But that kind of speaks to the point that you can do different kinds of digital work, as a coder or not. So we've been highlighting things like Recogito and Arches that you don't need to have that coding sort of ability and Zooniverse to use, although as we've hinted, to make the most of these things, you do need a lot of that knowledge or the ability to unpack and work out how the thing works and what you can make it do. So we've actually reached the point where we were going to move to our 10-minute break. So as I say, please do have a. I'm just going to post again in case anyone arrived late, the Zooniverse link. So please do use the next 10 minutes to have a play with that, or equally importantly, get up, have a stretch of your legs, have a make a cup of tea, whatever it is you want, depending if you're in the morning, the middle of the day, the evening, or whatever. We will be back in 10 minutes. So at 10 minutes to, we will be starting again with Geoff and Alex. So we will turn our cameras off for the next 10 minutes and then see you back here soon. Okay, so it's just turned 13:50 on my computer, so I will hand over to Geoff. I've just asked Sarah if she could stop sharing her presentation so that we can share the other one, and I'll hand over to Geoff to get going with part 2.
Thanks so much, Becky. Hi, everyone. Hopefully some of you are back. I am going to slowly re-begin this session, as I'm sure people are dashing from their kitchens where they're making a cup of tea to come back to their laptops, realizing that it's just on the hour. So we've got about 40 minutes where we're both myself and my colleague Alex are going to talk you through the project that we've been working on over the last couple of years called Communities and Crowds. This session will be a bit of us talking to you, and then we're going to actually make you do stuff, which is really exciting. You're going to have to go off and test our brand new volunteer-created citizen science project called How Did We Get Here? Is really important because we are right as of this week in the middle of our beta test. So we're hoping to get as much feedback as possible before we make some changes, and improve it a little bit, and then launch it to the public later this month. So welcome back, everyone, to this exciting session where we'll get a chance to talk a little bit later about citizen science and data projects and history of science more generally related to museum collections. But what we're going to do now for the next little while is talk to you about this project called Communities and Crowds. This started in the start of 2021, and it's a collaboration between the Science and Media Museum, National Science and Media Museum in Bradford, where I was the head curator. I'm now at the National Museum of Scotland, with Zooniverse, both at the Universities of Oxford and the Adler Planetarium in Chicago. The person not here that is very much represented in this work is Dr. Sam Blicken, who is the head, the co-director of Zooniverse and the head of humanities at the Adler Planetarium. And the project is funded through the AHRC to look ultimately at how we can bridge the gap between in-person volunteering through museum collections and online volunteering. It started with a fairly simple question, which was, museums are really quite good at in-person volunteering. Some museums better than others, but they have lots of experience in being able to bring people into collections or into the museum infrastructure and working with them to do different things. Museums are starting to get a little bit better at working with online citizen science or online volunteering. There are good examples of the Natural History Museum or Tate or many others who have citizen science platforms, the British Library, the British Museum as examples. But what both citizen science or digital humanities and museums don't really do is connect the two types of volunteering, in-person volunteering and online volunteering. So we developed this project to look if we could create some new workflows and pipelines where volunteers are actually at the helm, in charge of the decision-making structure around what gets digitized, digitizing those images themselves or digital assets, creating digital assets, and then using that to create a brand new citizen science project. And we were right in the phase where our volunteers have created a brand new, amazing citizen science project that's been led by both their own digital assets and questions that they are interested in creating. I'm really excited that a couple of our volunteers at least are here in the audience today. Hopefully you'll get a chance to talk to them. If not, at the end of the session, then afterwards, to hear more about what they thought about the project. So without further ado, what is the project? It is looking at starting with a very large photographic collection and trying to answer a fairly typical curatorial problem, which is how do we deal with a photographic collection of this size? So this is the Daily Herald newspaper archive, which is part of the Science Museum Group. It is about 3.5 million photographs plus about 100,000 glass plate negatives. So a very large archive, very interestingly organized. It is still exactly the way it was kept and structured by the Daily Herald newspaper, one of the largest mid-20th century national newspapers for the UK. It is organized as a photographic editor's archive. So it's still structured in very specific ways. It's structured around the image, the information infrastructure that an editor for a newspaper might have wanted to be able to find information. It represents pretty much anything a newspaper reader might have been interested in throughout the 20th century. So it has both interesting and very problematic content, language, and topics throughout the whole of the archive. But it is too large for any institution really to be able to fully digitize and document, because there are so many images and there's so much content. And because of that, there's also so many stories that could be told through this kind of collection. So we use this as a starting point by working with a set of volunteers. So creating a call out to volunteers in and around Bradford that were interested in finding stories that were interested to them. We were very lucky that we found a group of amazing, dedicated volunteers, some of which came from the local Bradford Afro-Caribbean community, but it kind of expanded slightly outside of that as we worked through this collection over the next kind of year and a half. We were really keen because we knew that some of the content could be pretty traumatic or potentially traumatic. We wanted to make sure that the actual in-person volunteering session had a very specific structure to it that allowed for time for reflection, for discussion, for taking time away from the images if necessary, while actually also doing the work of documentation, digitization, and classification. So we've created this workflow where volunteers have come in on a Thursday and spent 3 hours, of which that time, is just looking at the images and preparing, some is chance to talk and reflect, some is doing the work, commencing the work, doing the documentation in pairs, and happy afterwards to talk about how the specific model of digitization documentation worked. Then we would all go out and have a coffee or tea break, have some cookies and some tea, and then come back, debrief, do a little bit of wrapping up work, and then finish for the day. And we've been doing that pretty consistently for the last year and a half, working to create some really amazing digital assets. So what we try to do is also create a workflow that doesn't directly replicate the in-house museum practice for documentation and digitization, but that tries to reflect that to create good data that works for the museum and its infrastructure. So we're following the same kind of best practice principles, such as using Melanex sleeves, rehousing everything. We are using the Science Museum Group's barcoding methodology, which they have brought in for many of their other collections. And we've made sure that data, as it comes in, gets clearly documented and classified into our collections management system. Interestingly, we're not going to talk about it here, but if you're interested, we've also worked with the data managers at Science Museum Group to create a kind of extra CMS collections management system infrastructure called AppSheet, which has allowed a lot more flexibility in how we enter data in without going directly into a collections management system. At the same time, or in pairs, the digitization of those digital assets would then be done. You can see one of our volunteers here doing the digitization of the photographs, as well as some of the post-processing of those images to make sure that they were cropped, color corrected, and put into the correct folders. So throughout this process, what were created were both amazing objects for digital assets. So this is one example from the Daily Herald collection that was digitized by our volunteers. And we also had great opportunity for reflection and discussion. So this is one of our volunteers, Maureen, talking about this image itself and what it meant to her.
There's a picture that when we were going through it, it just popped out. It sort of speaks to me, and it's a black woman. This picture was taken on the 26th of April, 1968. And there's a black woman, very, very elegantly head wrapped, walking the gauntlet. And this was she was passing St. Stephen's Church outside the House of Commons. And outside there were porters from Spitalfield Market demonstrating in support of Enoch Powell. Now, when we think about back in the 60s and all the immigration, changes and everything about Enoch Powell, River of Blood, this woman is walking. There's lots and lots of white men, but in all of that, there's the police as well. And for her to walk past that demonstration must have been powerful. She must have been a very, very strong woman in her self-belief, the way she carried herself. She didn't look like she was struggling, and she just walked. And for me, it just says everything about standing up for who you are, speaking out,
Great. So that was Maureen talking about this image, which I think really reflects some of the powerful reflection that was happening in the collections as they were working with the objects themselves. But importantly, importantly, the next step in creating the value of these images is to connect it to the potential for creating a citizen science platform, which my colleague Alex is going to talk about briefly in a second. For those of you that have used Zooniverse before, what you might understand is that there is an important part of discussion and discourse that is part of a Zooniverse project. There is a talk function and a place to discuss and dialogue with fellow citizen scientists, but there's a limitation to that. It only happens after you've classified an object. So part of this project was actually working with Zooniverse to try to improve or change that infrastructure. So as part of Communities and Crowds, we are also testing on this new project, which you will find in a second, a new talk infrastructure we're calling Quick Talk. And what that looks like is this. So on the right-hand side of the Zooniverse screen, as you're classifying, you will see this little pop-up button on the bottom right-hand side that looks like a text box. If you click that, that allows you to enter into discussion or see what discussion has already happened around this classified object that reflects or is just a reflection of the talk screen after the classification is usually done. So we're hoping that this allows for more natural conversation to see what's already been done and to improve that work or improve upon the work of others while they're doing it. So that's enough for me. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Alex, who's going to tell you about building the Zooniverse project itself.
So yeah, our kind of volunteer-led approach has continued into the planning and development of the Zooniverse phase of the project, with our project team supporting the volunteers in designing the online platform to suit their ambitions for the archival materials that they had curated. So this included exploratory sessions during which the volunteers were encouraged to explore other Zooniverse projects to really get inspiration for their own, as well as kind of these discussion sessions, which have been used to identify the volunteers' own goals for this stage of the project. So in the slide here, this chart is something we used in one of our discussion sessions, just to kind of plan out, what exactly the volunteers wanted to do, how they would do it based on the kind of workflows that they had seen, and the kind of questions that they were looking to ask. So through these sessions, we were able to highlight that the volunteers were very keen on the engagement and the dialogue potential of Zooniverse, and the ways in which this correlated with a broader goal of increasing the accessibility of the Daily Herald archives to the wider community. Drawing from their own experiences of working in the archives, the volunteers have been able to identify several goals and kind of related questions for Zooniverse, mostly focused on capturing experience and knowledge that have been obtained from working with these selected archival images. Next slide. So the volunteers did kind of struggle with deciding on the sort of tasks that they wanted to set for the digital volunteers on Zooniverse. Part of this was due to the kind of difficulty in visualizing the resulting Zooniverse project, especially when none of the volunteers had previously been knowledgeable about the platform. And to be honest, neither had I. So it is quite difficult to kind of visualize something you really don't know that much about. And, we had also spent much of our time on this project working in person on digitizing the archival materials. So it was a very big shift that we'd be making into the kind of Zooniverse phase of the project. But despite this kind of lack of knowledge about Zooniverse, there was still a lot of excitement regarding this phase of the project and, its potential impact on expanding visibility of the curated archival materials. So with this in mind, the volunteer sessions eventually kind of shifted to focus more on really in-depth conversations about Zooniverse as a tool of engagement, resulting in the creation of this diagram, which kind of something we all worked out collectively to create. And I think it was really useful as it really helped clarify the role of Zooniverse in the project. So by visualizing Zooniverse as a means of expanding access to the Daily Herald archives and acting as, I think it was Maureen who said it's a stepping stone for further work outside the Communities and Crowds project, the volunteers were able to kind of narrow down a bit more their research questions and kind of really identify the kind of tasks that would be best suited to fit those inquiries. Next slide, please. So to help in determine what kind of tasks would be reflective of the sort of questions that we had kind of identified through these sessions. The volunteers were also asked to kind of be part of a paper prototype session. So they were able to kind of simulate the experience of a Zooniverse volunteer by using some of the previously selected archival materials from the Daily Herald archive. They were basically asked, and I hopefully try to simulate this on the slide, they were basically asked to approach these materials as though it had been their first time seeing them, and to kind of act out some of the proposed tasks, transcribing the text that's found on the photographs, classifying them based on subject and location. We also talked about the sort of reactions and questions that would be generated through this work, and what they might want to research further. The volunteers also had a great opportunity to do this in some of our in-person outreach events that we had done for Black History Month and for Windrush Day. So a lot of opportunities to see how other people kind of reacted to these images, and to figure out how we carry that forward in the Zooniverse project. So after we did these kind of sessions, we would discuss what sort of information we were able to gain through these tasks, and how this new information not only enhanced the archival materials, but also connected some of their previously identified goals and questions. So in the follow-up discussion sessions, we were able to kind of narrow it down to basically two tasks: a transcription task for transcribing text on the back, on the front and backs of images, as well as a kind of classification task, classifying particularly based on location, as well as classifying and identifying editorial marks. And we were able to connect these to those kind of broader research questions about, what's being depicted in these images, what's kind of stories are being represented, what kind of communities are also being represented, and the kind of reactions that people will be having to these images. Next slide. So now that we had the general kind of framework of the project, we needed to start designing specific elements, such as the look of the web pages and the text. Again, it seems like a very small thing, but it was vital for us to ensure that the Zooniverse project not only reflected the goals and objectives of the volunteers, but also echoed their voice as well, and that means within the text. So we had a master's placement student with us, actually, who helped support this work. Which is really a really great kind of collaborative thing that we were able to do all together. So we had the volunteers basically just describe the project as they would be describing the project to anyone who wasn't really familiar with communities and crowds. And they were asked to kind of talk about what they felt were the most important elements of the research that be highlighted in kind of the descriptive text located through the Zooniverse page. We also asked the volunteers to think about what the kind of best advice on working with the archival materials would be if they were, say, providing it to a new volunteer who was joining the project, which would inform the development of workflow and tutorial texts. And again, because we actually had this master's placement student joining in, we had the opportunity of them to do that in person. So a lot of many opportune moments in our kind of development sessions that was really helpful. So we would basically generate loads and loads of text from these discussions that our placement student would transcribe, and then kind of translate them into more organized text that would later be refined and revised by the volunteers over several sessions. This slide kind of showcases a little bit of the refining and revising period, and where it has ended up in the final published version, or at least for now. So yeah, this will hopefully be all the text that you'll see on the finished project. Next slide. So the volunteers were also able to decide on the general design of the Zooniverse page, choosing images from the digitized selection that they felt best represented the ideals of the project. Again, it was a lot of discussion on that. On the left side of the slide are a couple of the choices that we put together as far as voting. because obviously it's a very collaborative approach to this. And it was definitely difficult, I think, for some of us to kind of identify what was the best image to really encompass all this work they've done. But I think they did a great job in picking. And if you do the beta test, you'll see which one actually ended up on there. The Zooniverse development process was also a really interesting period of kind of reflection for the volunteers, as it required them to think back to the start of their involvement in the Communities and Cows project and really use that experience learning how to navigate the archives and how to kind of look at all of the archival materials from the archives and use that to inform the kind of support that we were hopefully giving the new volunteers at Zooniverse through all this text that we were generating. So for example, and Sarah mentioned it in their part of the talk, Zooniverse allows for the creation of field guides to provide more in-depth explanations for certain elements that volunteers will encounter while participating. So I have that here on the right side of this slide, just kind of the development session notes and how it translated into the finished project. So our volunteers specifically asked for guides to be created around things that they found to be particularly confusing or things that they realized that they was really important to understand and be able to identify when they first started working with the Daily Herald archives. So that includes identifying edit marks, differentiating between stamps belonging to various photographers and also picture agencies. So that is now all part of the field guides we have available. Next slide. So another theme that we ended up returning to in developing the Zooniverse project was that of sensitive and kind of problematic content. As Geoff mentioned at the start of our talk, this was an important element in designing the original workflows for selecting and digitizing images that the volunteers felt was important to carry over into the design of the Zooniverse project. The volunteers were able to collaborate on content warning texts that they felt were as best able to reflect the few images within the curated materials that they themselves had already identified as being potentially upsetting content, while also wanting to make it clear that, you know, we weren't obscuring this material either, that it was still quite important to have these images as part of this collection as record of kind of their shared history, including negative parts of that as well. So we were able to use some of the resources that were initially gathered for the start of the Communities and Cows project to support the volunteers in encountering upsetting content as part of the field guide chapter as well. So again, it's that bringing the whole kind of project full circle in a way. So that's what we have here on the slides. Just a lot of the very hopefully empathetic and supportive text that we developed. And they're not on the slides, but there's also several resources like a linked list that we have available on the field guides. So ultimately, I hope that we have been successful in being able to continuously and consistently provide space for volunteers to take ownership for the creation and development of this work, which we will maintain for the near future as we continue to hold check-in sessions alongside the volunteering on Zooniverse to ensure that the progression of the project still, correlates with the volunteers' main goals and interests. And our volunteers will continue to shape some of the outcomes of this work, providing further input into publications and the possible development of future plans for the project. Their vision has basically been the guiding light for much of this work. And hopefully, as you can see from this presentation, hopefully you'll be able to see with the beta test, clearly all that's really been needed from an institutional perspective has been, providing the support, space, and guidance when necessary for them to develop their own project on their own terms. So that's it for me for now. So hand it back to Geoff.
Thanks, Alex. And if I was able to drum roll, I would drum roll now, because now is the turn for everyone to take a chance to give us feedback. So here is the link for the beta test for How Did We Get Here. Alex is going to put it in the chat shortly. If I can ask everyone to go and play around with the website for the next 10 minutes. So if you want to come back at 25 minutes past, While you're doing it, there is also a feedback form that's on the top, that's here in the chat and is on the top of the website. If you can get a chance, both either now or later, to fill that in, that's also incredibly useful for us. And while you're gone, there's just a couple of questions we want you to think about. Does it work? What didn't work? What would you like to be different? And then we'll come back, we'll have a chance to answer some of those things and then open up to a wider conversation. See you in 10 minutes. Go play. All right, folks, welcome back. Hopefully some of you, if not all of you, went and had to play around with how did we get here. If now is the opportunity to come back, and if you have any immediate questions, anything that you'd like to add or feedback on how did we get here, the Zooniverse project or the project more generally, we are open ears. We've got about 5 minutes, and then I'll invite Becky and Sarah and everyone actually that wants to turn their camera back on or on in the first instance and join in a more fluid conversation. We're hoping to have a little bit more dialogue for the last kind of 20 minutes. So open to any questions. Let me see if I bet Q&A or chat is quiet.
I jump in while people are thinking. I was just wondering where there were issues that came up where the volunteers, I mean, obviously they may not have agreed amongst themselves, but where there was tension over a particular issue where they wanted to do something that, from a museum perspective, didn't seem comfortable.
That's a really good question. Alex, you might be better situated to answer that because you were working more week to week with the volunteers.
Yeah, I mean, they're a very agreeable group, and I'm not just saying that because some of them are in the audience right now. They are very much, there was very little, actually none really, conflict. I think there was occasionally cases of, having a bit of a broader ambition for something that we had to maybe dial back a little bit because of the confines of the project itself, or the confines of Zooniverse. Nothing really that big, but every so often little bits of kind of saying, we actually need to change this a little bit to fit the confines of what Zooniverse can do. Which, they were all very agreeable and amendable with, because I think they understood that, we were working within a already existing platform. But yeah, I mean, we also were just very lucky with the volunteers that agreed to work on this project. They were all, incredibly motivated and still are, and it's been a real honor to be working with them.
I would add on top of that, I think this didn't at all come from the volunteers, but one of the difficulties that was found was actually consistently affording access to the collections for the volunteers was a real consistent and ongoing problem. Part of that being because we started and went through much of the volunteering work during the pandemic. So there was lots of chops and changes with access and access routes. But more fundamentally than that, what it really showcased was being able to give consistent access needs to people with different mobility needs to a collections area that required you to be in person in order to do that. We didn't have the answers for that, but I think it's certainly helping inform some of the recommendations that we might be able to make coming out of the end of this project about what real cohesive collaborative work looks like and what institutions need to do to break down some of those barriers. There is a question in the chat from Alexander. Do we plan to offer tutorials, workshops for specific groups of people, teachers who might want to spread the word further? It's a great question. So it's a two-parter answer for you. The first is yes, we have a workshop actually coming up on the 20th of July, where we are we're planning to have it as a hybrid. We can send around the information for registration if you want towards the end of the day, where we're going to share this work and a bit more broader experience from the volunteers, as well as some of the other people that have worked on the project to think about how this might apply to other collections or other institutions. We are also starting a project in the NMS collections, which we can hopefully share about soon. But one of the other outcomes for this project, which isn't yet developed, are a set of toolkits that we can share with people to apply it to their collections and to their own institutions, or if they're historians of science or researchers that want to apply it and work in collaboration with collections to do this kind of work. Great. So I think that's lots of opportunity to chat about communities and crowds, but maybe we can open up the conversation more generally. For those that do want to turn your camera on, please feel